Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look on what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with journalist and author Christina Patterson and the Times and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed. So let's see what's on some of those front pages, shall we? Senior public health leaders from across the UK are accusing Boris Johnson of, quote, letting COVID rip by relaxing legal restrictions on Monday. That's on the front of The Observer. Britain faces disruption to food supplies, transport networks and industry as COVID-19's third wave intensifies, The Times reports. The Daily Express leads with a prominent business leader warning that a return to full freedom in England has been hit by the government's confusing guidance over wearing masks and workers having to isolate after being pinged by the Test and Trace app. The Telegraph reports that Britain has opted against mass COVID vaccinations for all children and teenagers, with ministers instead preparing to offer the jabs just to vulnerable 12 to 15-year-olds and those about to turn 18. The Daily Star claims almost 55,000 army personnel are yet to have a first COVID jab. And we're joined tonight, as I was saying, by Christina Patterson and Matthew Syed. Good evening to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. An interesting evening. Let's kick off with The Observer. Matthew, just take us through this, because it's a bit of a tricky one for the PM, isn't it? With the Health Secretary testing positive and that PCR result just coming in, what, a few moments ago?
So, yeah, that's right. So it's possible, given that Sajid Javid has had meetings with the Prime Minister and presumably across the Cabinet and throughout Whitehall, that it could, if they are asked to self-isolate as a consequence of this positive test for the Health Secretary, it could bring the government to something of a standstill at a critical juncture with the last opening of restrictions due and imminent. So that's a very interesting question. I mean, I personally think that in those circumstances, although it would to a certain extent bring the regulations into disrepute if they weren't obeyed by the sitting government, it's very, very important for the government to carry on doing what it needs to be doing. I mean, for what it's worth, I also think that this pinging, one needs to have, I think there's a big problem with it overall. But the wider picture is one of massive, huge uncertainty. There are so many different dimensions to the decisions that are being made, the slight reversal in government policy that we're seeing in terms of the easing of restrictions. The language is changing dramatically, and I suspect will continue to change as the number of infection goes up. But anyone who tells you they have a definitive view of how the next few weeks will pan out, when the epidemic will peak, and what it might mean for a very potentially tricky winter, I think they'll be certifiable.
Christina, what do you think? It is going to be interesting. According to The Observer, the Health Secretary is understood to have visited Number 10 on Friday. It is going to be interesting if the PM is self-isolating on the so-called Freedom Day.
Well, I was. I mean, nobody could be pleased that anybody is ill, and I absolutely wish Sajid Javid well as soon as possible. But you do sort of have to laugh at the symbolism if there is neither a health secretary nor a prime minister to be present at the press conference launching so-called Freedom Day. I mean, frankly, it sums up the chaos about as well as anyone could possibly imagine. The point is that this whole Freedom Day is a kind of fetishization of something that is simply not possible during a pandemic. And the reason it's happening is because of pressure from Tory backbenchers and the more libertarian aspects of the right-wing press. The so-called COVID recovery group have, with people like Steve Baker and Mark Harper, which has quite a few members, has made it very clear to Boris Johnson that they wouldn't vote for a continuation of any kind of restrictions because they are absolutists and ideologues. And Boris Johnson doesn't want to rely on Labour support, even though I'm sure he would get it for continuing restrictions. So the net result of that is that we have the second highest rate of infections in the world, even before Freedom Day. Only Indonesia and Brazil have more positive cases per day at the moment. And we are literally the only country in the whole world who are releasing all legal restrictions at a time of exponential rise, which certainly makes us world-beating. If we want to present the new global Britain, it's not the version of it that many of us would have chosen, but it's the version of it that we're getting. And the fact that Sajid Javid, who has been doubly jabbed, has got COVID is a reminder that about 50%, depends on which study you look at, but the AstraZeneca jab, for example, which is certainly what I've had, 2 doses, while infinitely better than nothing and very good at keeping people out of hospital and preventing deaths, does not stop people getting COVID. It has about a 55% chance of stopping you developing active COVID symptoms, and it reduces spread by about 50%, not necessarily more than that. So vaccination is obviously a brilliant tool in our armoury, but it can't be the whole armoury. And our government, having only offered it to 2/3 of the adult population, the job is not done yet, are opening everything. And many, many people will pay the price.
You talk of, Christina, I mean, you do talk of case rates, but also, I mean, this news this evening that Sajid Javid has tested positive, do you not think it also demonstrates that the link between case rates and hospitalizations has been broken and death rates has also been broken? And that's what we should be focusing on.
No, it's been weakened. It hasn't been broken. Deaths are going to be rising a lot. If we're looking at, say, we're looking at sort of 40
What is a
or 50,
lot?
Well, I mean, the current predictions are probably a good 20,000, between 12 and 20,000 more deaths in the next few months, which is not nothing. But to be honest, my biggest anxiety is about the youngsters who are going to get long COVID. At the moment, predictions are that between 10 and 20% of people who get COVID develop long COVID. Many people, about 400,000, are still ill after a year. That's an awful thing to inflict on youngsters. I was debilitated by an autoimmune disease in my 20s. Thank goodness I got over it, but I do know how debilitating it can be, and it really messed up a big chunk of my 20s, and I wouldn't impose that on anyone.
Yeah. Let's go to the Sunday Telegraph story. Matthew, what do you think? I just want to prefix it by saying that the Health Department has said that the government will continue to be guided by the advice of the JCVI and that no decisions have been made by ministers on whether people aged 12 to 17 should be routinely offered COVID-19 vaccines. But what's the Sunday Telegraph saying, Matthew?
Well, they are reporting here on the front page that the Joint Committee on Vaccinations have recommended that for the time being, children will not be offered the vaccine unless they're at serious risk or their parents or carers or people in the household have immune deficiencies. And I guess it will be up to the ministers to determine whether they accept this advice. But if this is correct, it's a holding policy, as I understand it, until they gather more evidence. So for the time being, that will be the case. Perhaps to go back to what Christina was saying, she will know, given that we often do this paper review together, that I have been very cautious about the lifting of restrictions since last March 2020. But I do want to just say that there is a clear risk in easing restrictions. But I'm keen to know Christina's view, because I feel very conflicted about this, that there is also a risk of keeping the restrictions in place, because it could well mean that at a time when the NHS is typically under strain in the winter, there will be another surge of infections. And therefore, if we keep the restrictions now, we may not be able to release them at all going through winter. And I'll just be keen to understand. Christina was very clear, if I may ask you. I mean, I know I'm meant to be answering questions here, but I'm keen to know your view. You don't think there's also a risk there, Christina, that we may never get out of, because variants will continue to come. We know the beta variant may well make the AstraZeneca vaccine less effective. We know that there are mutations happening somewhere in the world at all times. And if we lock down, we do not build up any immunity. We will just be a virgin population when that. So I'm just curious to know that you don't think there's some at least alternative risk of keeping the restrictions in place.
Just briefly, Christina, because we do have to go to a break soon, but please go ahead.
Okay. I don't think we should be opening all restrictions now. I suspect that we'll be reimposing them come September or October, because I think we're going to see really exponential rise. I think that you shouldn't open nightclubs to unvaccinated people during a pandemic. I just don't think it's a sensible thing to do. The easy thing of keeping mandatory masks on public transport would have been such a straightforward, easy win. It would have protected many people, but because of the libertarian backbenchers, including Boris Johnson, that's not happening. So no, I don't think we should be opening up now. I think there are no perfect scenarios in this situation. It's a dreadful situation, but I think we shouldn't be going for world-beating liberation. It's not a thing to be beating the world on, frankly.
Press preview. With me now are the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the Times and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed. Hello again. Let's kick off this time. Sunday Express, the front, is talking about the weather. I suppose at least it means we're not talking about COVID. Whose story is this?
Well, shall I go first? Because I mean, I have to say it's probably too much information, given that we're talking on national
You're among
television.
friends, Matthew.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We had a glorious day today. I live in southwest London, and I haven't been to Gunnersbury Park in Ealing for about 30 years, and my mother's cousins are all Londoners, and they texted me last night and said they were going to be in Gunnersbury Park, and I hadn't seen them for many, many years, which is partly my fault because I haven't been to enough family events. It was absolutely glorious watching people play football, going on the lake, doing a bit of boating. We played frisbee. My mum's uncle Michael, who's 93 years old, was there with his wife, Auntie Joan. And we sat and chatted about his war experiences, which I hadn't known about previously. He served on an aircraft carrier. And I've got to tell you, it's one of the best days I've had in months, if not years. And it just made me realise, I know we've got to be careful with COVID, Christina, I understand that. But we are social animals. And that sense of joy and connection that you have when you socialise with people you care about, it's an absolutely wonderful thing. It's central to what it means to be human. And if there was a prospect for me of long-term restrictions for years and years, or taking a bit off my life expectancy, I would definitely take a bit off my life expectancy.
Well, let's have a look at that page again, the front page of the Express, because it is just a great photo, isn't it? And at least it says, at least the sun's got us smiling again. So that's a nice little story to start the segment off with. Christina, what is this about robot wars at Ocado?
Yes, well, I'm afraid this one did make me laugh. That obviously it isn't funny that a warehouse had a terrible fire as a result, but 3 robots apparently bumped into each other, and that caused a fire.
Oh, that huge fire! It was a couple of months ago, wasn't it?
Is that what it was? I didn't realise it was a couple of months ago, but and I certainly didn't realise it was caused by robots until I saw this piece. But it does show that the future. The robots are not foolproof. They have their built-in problems, and that certainly sounds like one of them, because one thing we humans don't do, we might infect each other. We don't generally cause huge fires that go on for hours and hours and hours and demolish buildings by bumping into each other. So that's one great advantage and one thing we can cling on to, as well as sunshine at the moment. And I have to say, Matthew, I had a wonderful day sitting. I had a book to review, but sitting in the garden in my cosy, which I haven't worn since last summer, and it was just heaven sitting in the sunshine. And I do think, one could almost forget there was a pandemic. When the sun comes out, we're also pathetically grateful in this country when the sun comes out. It's almost worth having the terrible climate the rest of the year just to enjoy it when it does come out.
That's when you know you've had a good couple of hours when you can forget the coronavirus. I just stand corrected. It was a fire in southeast London on Friday at Ocado, not that huge one we saw years ago. Christina, yours again. Sorry, Matthew, I don't know if you've read this one. Legal action for tech age discrimination. That's on the front of the Telegraph. Do you both know about this? Do you want to go, Matthew?
Yeah. Sorry.
You go ahead, Christina.
Well,
now I'm confusing everyone.
No, don't worry. I think this is quite an important one, actually, because it's the equalities watchdog. The new chairman or chairwoman is saying that it will tackle age discrimination as well as other types of discrimination. And I do think that's really important. The context that's given is about tech de-skilling, and she thinks that middle-aged women might be particularly at risk of being forced out of companies through tech sort of developments, and the fact that we might not be able to cope, poor darlings. I very much doubt that tech is the issue. What I do know is that women, middle-aged women, are disproportionately affected, more made redundant than men, and they do find it harder to get back.
I've got to jump in there. We're just about to